A man, naked from the waist down and broken beyond recognition, whispered the same phrase again and again, "Let me die." His lips, blistered and blackened from screaming, barely managed to form the words. His body twitched involuntarily, not from strength, but from a nervous system, struggling to register pain it could no longer process. The crowd watched in stunned silence as steam rose from his opened abdomen, the damp November air mingling with the metallic scent of human blood and charred flesh. Those who had jeered earlier now stood paralyzed, as if unsure whether they were witnesses or accomplices. This was no criminal's execution. It was a political exorcism. His executioners weren't just killing a man. They were crafting a message in gore and agony. This is what happens when you climb too high, too fast, and too close to the king. The man writhing in the dirt was Hugh Despenser the Younger, a former royal favorite, once the most powerful man in England after the king himself. He was now reduced to a spectacle of suffering, begging for death that refused to come quickly. He wasn't hanged until dead. He wasn't beheaded in mercy. He was methodically destroyed piece by piece while still alive, because a simple death wasn't enough. And that was the point. To understand how a man of noble birth ended up mutilated, burned, and quartered before a cheering crowd, we must return to a world where royalty governed not by rule books, but by terror, and where execution was not punishment, but theater. A world where power was performative and suffering was political capital. This is not just the story of a man who died badly. It is the story of a man who was unmade his name, his body, and his humanity disassembled in full view of the kingdom he once helped rule. And it begins, as many horrors do, with ambition. By the time Hugh Despenser the Younger was dragged into the market square at Hereford, in late November 1326, he was no longer a man. He was a symbol, a lightning rod for public fury, perennial resentment, and royal shame. To most, he wasn't Hugh anymore. He was the leech, the usurper, the corrupter of the crown. And for that, he would pay not with a clean death, but with pain so precise it bordered on ritual. But who was he before the horror Hugh Despenser was born into nobility, not royalty, but close enough to taste it? The Despensers had served the crown faithfully for generations. But Hugh was not content to serve. From a young age, he showed the traits most dangerous in a courtier ambition without fear: charm without conscience, loyalty without limit. He became Edward II's favorite, and then more than a favorite. Rumors swirled that their bond was not only political but intimate. Historians still debate the nature of their relationship, but perception alone was enough. Despenser wielded royal influence with terrifying freedom. He controlled appointments, seized lands, intimidated rivals, and rewrote the balance of power with a pen soaked in self-interest. In less than a decade, Hugh Despenser had gone from noble son to the most hated man in England, and he knew it. Contemporary accounts paint him as cruel, greedy, and arrogant. He extorted land from widows. He imprisoned rivals without cause. He weaponized the king's affection to trample anyone who stood in his way. Whether these stories were true, exaggerated, or convenient political fiction hardly mattered. Perception became sentence. Rumor became justification. By 1326, the barons, long frustrated by Despenser's iron grip on the king, were no longer content to grumble. Queen Isabella, Edward's own wife, had turned against both her husband and the court. She returned from diplomatic exile in France with a new lover, Roger Mortimer, and an army. At her side marched not only foreign soldiers but also the righteous rage of the English elite. Their objective was not just to dethrone Edward, it was to destroy Hugh Despenser in the most humiliating way imaginable. Because in their eyes, Despenser hadn't just corrupted the king, he had corrupted the very idea of kingship. This wasn't justice, it was cleansing. And when the sentence came, it would reflect the hatred of an entire class. But before the knives, before the fire, before the blood-soaked square, Despenser would face one final humiliation, being stripped of his identity step by step, until he became only what they needed him to be, a monster worth destroying. To understand why Hugh Despenser's death was not merely an execution, but a spectacle, we must first understand the political world he helped set ablaze. Early 14th century England was a crucible of instability. King Edward II, the first English monarch to face outright deposition by force, had proven ill-equipped for the brutal demands of medieval kingship. He lacked the charisma of his father, Edward III, a warrior king known as the Hammer of the Scots. Instead, Edward II was introspective, passive, and above all, dependent on favorites. First it was Piers Gaveston, a flamboyant courtier whose closeness to the king invited whispers and contempt. When Gaveston was executed by jealous barons, the vacuum he left behind was soon filled by Hugh Despenser. Unlike Gaveston, Despenser was not flamboyant. He was calculating, a man of method and long memory. He climbed the political ladder not through charm, but through relentless, tactical cruelty. And Edward, grieving and isolated, clung to him like a lifeline. By 1322, Despenser was at the height of his influence. As royal chamberlain, he controlled access to the king, manipulated legal processes, and accumulated vast lands through forced confiscations. He punished barons who defied him with imprisonment, blackmail, and even execution. His family was elevated far beyond their station, becoming England's unofficial rulers. The nobility, humiliated and dispossessed, began to awaken. But the final betrayal came not from the battlefield or foreign court. It came from within the royal household. Queen Isabella of France, consort to King Edward II, had once tolerated Hugh Despenser's presence. But as his power grew, she was pushed to the margins. Her lands were seized. Her allies were driven from court. Her royal status was undermined by a man she would later call, in her letters, the king's evil counselor. In 1325, under the guise of a diplomatic mission, Isabella left England for France. But she had no intention of returning. Instead, she formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a baron who had once been imprisoned by Despenser and now sought vengeance. Their shared aim was not merely to survive or resist, it was to overthrow a regime together. Isabella and Mortimer raised an army in Hainaut, securing financial and military backing through a strategic marriage between their son, the future Edward III, and a foreign noblewoman. In September 1326, they crossed into England, expecting a fight. Instead, they found a kingdom ready to collapse. Nobles who had once cowered beneath Despenser's influence now rose in open rebellion. Entire cities defected to Isabella's cause. The people, impoverished by taxes and enraged by royal abuses, greeted her not as a traitor, but as a savior. Edward II and Hugh Despenser fled westward, disguised and desperate, watching their empire unravel in mere weeks. But even as they ran, Despenser refused to concede defeat. Chroniclers say he continued issuing orders, dressing in fine clothes, clinging to a delusion of control. He still believed he could outmaneuver his enemies. He could not. In late October, near the abbey town of Neath in Wales, the king and his favourite were captured. Edward, though disgraced, was treated with a semblance of royal dignity. Hugh Despenser was not stripped of privilege. He was dragged in rags before Queen Isabella's forces, bound backward on a starved horse, his unshaven face and soiled robes a far cry from the silks he once wore. His noble identity was peeled away like a scab. The sentence had not yet been declared, but his fate was written in the jeers of the crowd, in the contempt in Isabella's eyes, and in the blades already being sharpened for his final hour. At the time of his arrest, Despenser was no longer the lion of court politics. He was no longer shielded by titles or flattery. He was a fugitive, starving, filthy, trembling, but his identity, even in ruin, made him unforgettable. He was the man who had ruled beside the king. He was the villain they blamed for their suffering. And so, they made him suffer. His captors celebrated not with fanfare, but with humiliation. Despenser was dragged through the streets of Hereford, wrists bound, garments torn. The former chamberlain paraded like cattle. Onlookers hurled insults, rotting vegetables, dung, and obscenities. They called him names once spoken only in whispers: sodomite, tyrant, leech, traitor. The Queen's soldiers did not intervene. Some even encouraged it. This was more than revenge, it was the calculated erasure of reputation before the erasure of flesh. Period accounts describe Despenser as ghostly pale, trembling, and nearly mute. Some called it cowardice. Others, more honest, saw a man already broken. He had read the script and knew his role. There would be no trial, only theatre. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer had no interest in legal process. They wanted a symbol, not a defendant, and Hugh Despenser would be that symbol, a living effigy of corruption, a public offering to appease both nobility and commoners. Hanging was too simple, too clean. The people demanded blood. The nobles wanted spectacle. And Isabella, cold, deliberate, ruthless, wanted him reduced to memory and ash. Despenser was locked in Hereford Castle, under heavy guard, not for his safety, but to preserve his body for the horror to come. He was given no wine, no warmth, no information, just silence. Days passed. Then, without ceremony, the sentence was delivered. You are to be drawn, hanged, emasculated, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. Each punishment was more than method, it was metaphor. He would be drawn to the scaffold like livestock, denying him the dignity of standing. He would be hanged but cut down before death, forced to feel the bite of the rope without its release. He would be castrated, a deliberate nod to rumors of his intimate relationship with the king. An attack not just on his body, but on his masculinity and legacy. His entrails would be pulled out and burned before his eyes, a symbolic purging of internal corruption. His head would be cut off not to end suffering, but to mark it, to hold it aloft as proof. Finally, he would be quartered. 4 pieces of flesh, dispatched to 4 corners of the kingdom, a warning, nailed to city gates. This is what becomes of traitors who corrupt kings. This was not justice. It was ritualized human sacrifice. The second act of Hugh Despenser's story was ending not in defiance, but in complete submission, his identity stripped, his power gone, his fate sealed not by law, but by spectacle. And still, the worst was yet to come. The night before his execution, Hugh Despenser reportedly refused food. One chronicle suggests he tried to take his own life but was restrained, his hands bound tightly to the bed frame. Another account claims he was offered a priest but declined confession. Perhaps he feared it would be seen as an admission of guilt. Or perhaps, after all he had done and endured, he no longer believed in salvation. No one recorded his last words that night. They wouldn't matter. The real story, after all, would be in how he died. And the crowd that gathered in Hereford would not be disappointed. On the cold morning of November 24th, 1326, a makeshift court assembled not within stone walls, but in the open air beneath overcast skies. A restless, eager mass pressed against the wooden barriers surrounding the scaffold. This was not justice as we know it. There was no defense, no legal counsel, no deliberation. The verdict had been determined long before Despenser arrived. The charges were not read to establish truth, but to satisfy a narrative. Hugh Despenser was accused of treason, sodomy, theft, extortion, and corruption. Yet in 14th century England, these words bore layered meanings. Treason meant betrayal not just of the king, but of the kingdom's spiritual and moral order. Sodomy was less an act than a stigma, a political insult framed in religious language. Theft and extortion were flexible accusations, applied liberally to justify the seizure of his properties and power. Every charge had a purpose not to establish facts, but to build a monster. Most chilling of all was the verdict's literary rhythm. A clock read aloud, "You have returned the realm to ruin. You have led our lord the king to folly, turning his heart from queen and council. You have brought death to good men, shame to the crown, and disorder to God's order. Therefore, your death shall be likewise disordered, that your limbs be torn, as your loyalty was torn, that your shame be laid bare, that your soul be cast out." It wasn't enough to execute Despenser. His death had to symbolize cleansing, penance, and public retribution. He stood bound, filthy, and silent as the accusations echoed across the square. The crowd didn't react with horror. They roared in approval. "Traitor, burn!" The Letcher children sat on their father's shoulders. Ale was passed between neighbors. It was execution as carnival, a macabre festival of vengeance, and at its center stood a man about to be erased. He may have spoken final words, but if he did, they were lost in the noise. He was strapped to a wooden hurdle, a crude platform dragged through thick mud by horses. His body bounced violently with every bump. His arms were twisted behind him. His knees slammed against the stones of Hereford's streets. Rotten produce, offal, and spit rained down from the crowd. One woman leaned forward, spat into his bloodied face, and laughed. The journey was brief, but it shattered any dignity he had left. By the time Despenser reached the scaffold, he was a wreck. His garments were shredded. His skin was lacerated and bruised. His face bore the grime and shame of betrayal. The people, drunk on rage, leaned forward. Their appetite was whetted. The show was about to begin. The scaffold was low, deliberately so, not a platform of elevation or martyrdom, but a stage for public degradation. It had been built days in advance. This was not a space for justice. It was theater. Hugh Despenser was not a man now. He was the centerpiece of a brutal performance, bound hand and foot, half naked and shivering in the cold. Despenser was dragged onto the wooden boards. The scent of damp earth and congealed blood hung thick in the air, a reminder of Simon de Reading, Despenser's co-accused, executed only hours earlier. The crowd murmured with anticipation. Street vendors hawked meat pies and ale from the edges. Children laughed. This was not solemnity. It was spectacle. A priest approached. Despenser was forced to kneel, not for confession, not for absolution, but for display. His back arched in pain. His lips moved perhaps in prayer, perhaps in incoherent dread. No one listened. The priest was not there to intercede. He was there to signify that the church, too, had turned its face away. Then came the hangman. He approached with a length of rope not long enough for a proper hanging, just enough for a stranglehold. Despenser was hoisted by the neck, pulled upward by rope and raw muscle. His feet kicked wildly. He did not die. He was not meant to die. He was meant to suffer, to be displayed in agony, his body betraying him in full view of the people who had once feared him. Seconds dragged into a minute, then 2. His face darkened, his eyes bulged. At last, he sagged consciousness slipping away. Only then did they cut him down. He crumpled to the floor of the scaffold, gasping, eyes bloodshot and unfocused. Blood leaked from his nose. His mouth hung open, slack and swollen. His tongue lolled to the side, but he was still breathing. And this was only the beginning. Next came the knives. 2 assistants, executioners by trade. Torturers by reputation, stripped him completely. His pale flesh became the canvas on which royal revenge would be painted. The first cut was between his legs, a slow, deliberate incision with a dull blade. Flesh meant for creation, and pleasure now severed for spectacle. The crowd roared as the executioner held up the severed genitals, dripping and twitching, before casting them into a fire that hissed like a serpent. Despenser didn't scream. Not immediately. Shock buffered the pain. But the next incision, straight across the abdomen, shattered his numbness. Witnesses described a sound unlike anything human. Some said it was a gurgle. Others called it a low, unending moan, the sound of a soul clawing to escape a body that refused to die. He was pinned down as his intestines were pulled from his body, inch by inch. No rush, no mercy. Steam rose from his organs and mingled with the November air, curling skyward like incense. One chronicler described the stench as roasted meat and wet copper. They burned his bowels in front of him, a literal purging, as if flames could cleanse the soul. His consciousness flickered, returned, then vanished again, and each time he woke, he begged, not in sentences, just fragments. Let me, please, end. But there was no end yet. One eye had ruptured. His mouth opened and closed with no sound. Blood spilled freely, soaking the wooden boards until they shimmered in the gray autumn light. His hands opened and clenched, searching for something, anything to hold. A hand. A promise. Even death. But he found only air, finally. His heart was carved out, held aloft, still twitching, still steaming, still his. For a brief moment, silence overtook the crowd. Even they, drunk on vengeance, recognized a boundary had been crossed. This was no longer execution. It was annihilation. And then came the blade. It approached not as an act of mercy, but as a period at the end of a monstrous sentence. Hugh Despenser, now more wound than man, more symbol than body, was still alive. His heart had been beating just moments earlier when the executioner grabbed his matted, blood-soaked hair. They did not use a fine French blade, like the one brought for Anne Boleyn. Despenser's blade was English broad, dull, brutal, forged not to glide, but to grind. The first strike did not sever the neck. It tore through skin, muscle, and a shard of vertebrae. Blood gushed like a geyser, soaking the executioner's apron, splashing onto the boards. The second blow came down with force. The third completed the task. The executioner raised the head by the hair. The face was nearly unrecognizable, slack, bruised, eyes open, mouth frozen in a final scream. The crowd did not cheer. They simply stared. Then came the quartering. Despenser's mutilated body, still warm, was laid across the blood-soaked platform. The assistants returned with axes, not ceremonial tools, but the same implements used in slaughterhouses, one limb at a time, each joint disarticulated with practiced force. Bone cracked, sinew tore, blood flowed in rivulets across the wood. Horses stood ready. Each quarter was packed and dispatched to a different city: York, Bristol, Newcastle, Dover. Each fragment became a warning nailed to the gates. His torso, hollowed and emptied, was thrown to the flames. There would be no grave, no epitaph, no relics, only smoke, ash, and the sound of iron spikes hammered into wood. Even in death, Hugh Despenser was not remembered as a man. He was remembered as a message for Queen Isabella. The death of Hugh Despenser was not the end of tyranny, it was the beginning of her reign. That day in Hereford was not just vengeance, it was pageantry. The king was broken, the favourite destroyed, the queen and her consort, Roger Mortimer, now ruled. But brutality on that scale demands a second kind of execution, one not of body, but of legacy. The state launched a campaign not just to destroy Despenser's remains, but to obliterate his memory. Court poets rewrote his life into nightmare. Chroniclers described him not as a flawed man, but as a devil, a corrupter of kings, a sodomite, a thief, a violator of God's design. His crimes were exaggerated, his relationships twisted into weapons. His soul, it was said, had been black long before his entrails turned to ash. What the scaffold didn't erase, the pen would. Royal proclamations described his fate as divine retribution. Pamphlets celebrated the cleansing of the realm. Church bells rang in triumph as pieces of his body reached their destinations. Priests gave sermons thanking God for England's deliverance. And it worked. Within weeks, his name had become a curse. Parents warned children with it. His family lost titles, lands, and protections. His coat of arms was stripped from official ledgers. His bloodline became a stigma, a shame, a shadow. Not even his ghost remained. Because when a state truly wants to destroy someone, it doesn't stop with the body. It kills their history,